Hello and welcome. Today, we're jumping right into a pretty intense story, the economic history of India under British rule. It's a story of how one of the wealthiest countries on the entire planet was, well, systematically taken apart. Okay, just look at these numbers. Back in the year 1700, India's economy was an absolute juggernaut. We're talking 27% of the entire world's economy. That's more than all of Europe combined. Now, fast forward to 1947, the year the British left. That share, it had crashed to less than 3%. So how on earth does that happen? That's the big question we're going to unpack today. How does a country responsible for a quarter of the world's GDP get hollowed out so completely? It's a dark and, frankly, pretty methodical story of deliberate deindustrialization. To really get a grip on what was lost, we first have to understand what India was like before the British consolidated their power. And you know what? The reality might actually surprise you. And this isn't some kind of nationalist exaggeration. This quote comes from a 19th century American scholar, J.T. Sunderland. He was describing the India the British first ran into, a sophisticated, highly advanced, and incredibly wealthy manufacturing hub. So, what was the engine of this economy? Textiles. I mean, we're talking about a mind-blowing 25% slice of the entire global textile market. These weren't just basic cloths. These were high-end luxury goods from places like Bengal and Gujarat that were in demand all across the civilized world. And to move all those goods, India had to be a master of shipbuilding. And it was. The ports were churning out thousands of ships, and the quality was just top-notch. In fact, according to one British observer, ships built in Bengal were so well made, they lasted over 20 years, while the average English ship barely made it to 12. But it wasn't just textiles and ships. For centuries, India was a pioneer in metallurgy, producing this incredible high-quality steel, sometimes called wootz steel. The blades made from it were so legendary, they were status symbols for officers all over Europe and the Middle East. So you have this incredible, diverse, thriving manufacturing economy. How was it all unmade? Well, it wasn't an accident. Once the British seized control, they began to systematically re-engineer India's economy to serve their own needs, dismantling it piece by painful piece. Let's just use the textile industry as a case study. First, the British East India Company created a total monopoly, basically cutting India off from all its traditional customers. Then, instead of paying for goods with gold or silver, they just started using the tax money they were collecting from Indians. When that wasn't enough, they got brutal. They sent soldiers to physically smash the looms, and there are even accounts of them breaking the thumbs of weavers so they couldn't work. And the final nail in the coffin? This tariff. An 80% tax on Indian textiles being sent to the UK. Think about that. It created this impossible trap. It was now financially suicidal to sell to Britain, but they were legally blocked from selling to anyone else. The industry was just choked out of existence. And just in case you thought this was some kind of unfortunate side effect of policy, it wasn't. It was the entire point. I mean, you can't get much clearer than this quote from a British official. India was to become a captive market for British goods, period. The ripple effects were catastrophic. You had millions of skilled workers, weavers, merchants, shipbuilders, suddenly with no profession. Where could they go? They were forced into farming. As this wave of people flooded the countryside, wages just cratered and the land simply couldn't support everyone. And this is where economic destruction turns into just unimaginable human suffering. Because once you force most of a country's population onto farmland, you create a whole new opportunity for exploitation. The British rolled in with a tax system that was, well, it was completely alien to India. They pegged the rates at a staggering 50 to 80% of a farmer's gross income. The British themselves admitted that these rates were more than 3 times higher than anything under previous Indian rulers. And the way they collected these taxes was just horrifying. People who couldn't pay were tortured. Some were locked in cages and left out in the sun. It got so desperate that fathers sold their own children to meet the tax demands. And if you failed to pay, that was it. Your land was taken. This created millions of landless peasants, something that hadn't really existed before. The whole system was so predatory that in some areas, 2/3 of the population just fled. You know, that language, it's not from some critic. That's from a prime minister of the United Kingdom, the Marquis of Salisbury, openly talking about the policy as a way to bleed India of its money. The image of a Lancet, it's just chillingly accurate. And this bleeding, it had a devastating human cost. We're talking about an estimated 35 million preventable deaths from famines during British rule. Just to put that number in perspective, that's more than the deaths under Stalin, more than under Mao. And here's a glimpse of what that actually looked like from a British officer who was there. I mean, the scenes are just pure horror. And amid all of this, the official government policy was to do nothing. In fact, they kept exporting enormous amounts of grain out of India while actively trying to shut down any reporting on the starvation. So this brings us to the core question, right? Why? Why was British rule so uniquely and historically destructive compared to other foreign powers that had invaded India? And really, it all boils down to one fundamental difference. Previous invaders, like the Mughals, for example, eventually made India their home. They were conquerors, for sure, but they ultimately spent India's wealth in India. The British, though, they never saw India as home. It was always an extractive colony, a foreign asset whose only purpose was to be drained of its wealth and have that wealth shipped back to Britain. Now, you always hear the counter-argument, right? But wait a minute, what about the railways? Weren't the railways this great gift that proves the British were investing in India? Well, when you actually look closer, the story of the railways is a perfect example of this entire extractive system. The railways were essentially a guaranteed investment scheme for British shareholders, and it was paid for by Indian taxpayers. The construction was incredibly inefficient. It cost 9 times more per mile than in the US. Why? Because all the materials, every nut and bolt, were sourced from Britain, denying India the chance to build its own steel industry. And their main purpose? To get India's raw materials and grain out to the ports faster. So what's the final bill for all of this? Modern economic historians have tried to calculate the total amount of wealth drained from India over those 200 years. The number they came up with is around $43 trillion. In today's money, it's a number so large it's almost impossible to comprehend. And we'll end on this one final, powerful fact. For all the challenges and problems that modern India has faced, in the more than 70 years since the British left, there has not been a single large-scale famine. Not one. It just leaves you to wonder about the true legacy of it all.